Hello, I'm Justine Sims and I'm a solicitor in the property department at Osbornes Solicitors. Moving home can be a stressful and expensive time. Today I'd like to explain a little bit about how the conveyancing process works when buying a property. Usually by the time a buyer approaches the solicitor, they will have found a property to buy, had an offer accepted and have a mortgage offer in place. If a mortgage offer isn't in place, then this is the time when the buyer should apply for a mortgage, as exchange of contracts cannot take place until the mortgage offer has been received and checked by the buyer's solicitors. It is also at this point in the transaction when the buyer should consider having a survey undertaken against the property. The buyer can rely on the valuation report undertaken by the mortgage lender, but this is just a valuation and not a full survey. There are two types of survey, a home buyer's survey and a structural survey. For most buyers, a home buyer's survey will be sufficient. This highlights any major or significant problems with the property that require urgent attention. These problems can include timber infestation, damp or repairs to the roof. It is important for the buyer and the buyer's solicitors to be aware of these problems before exchange of contracts, as it may result in a reduction in the purchase price or requiring the seller to undertake the works prior to completion. Once the buyer has instructed a solicitor, the buyer's solicitors will receive from the seller's solicitors a pack of documents. This will include a draft contract, a copy of the title for the property, a property information form, a leasehold information form if the property is a flat, and a fittings and contents form. There may also be planning documents and guarantees. Once the buyer's solicitors have received these documents, they will undertake searches. These will almost certainly always include a local search and a drainage search. In addition, the buyer's solicitors may undertake an environmental search and a chancel repair liability search. There may also be searches that the buyer's solicitors will do which are relevant to the location of the property, such as a coal mining search and a brine search. When the buyer's solicitors have received all search results back, they will look through all the papers, including the papers received from the seller's solicitors, raise inquiries and approve the draft contract. Once the contract is approved and the buyer's solicitors have received replies to all inquiries from the seller's solicitors, the buyer's solicitors can then prepare their report to the client, setting out all the information about the property. The buyer's solicitor will now be ready to exchange contracts and will send the contract out to the client to sign and request the deposit monies. The deposit payable on exchange of contracts is usually 10% of the purchase price. For example, if you're buying a property for £200,000, your deposit would be £20,000. The buyer will also need to agree the completion date with the seller. This is usually 1 to 2 weeks after exchange of contracts. Once the buyer's solicitors have received the signed contract and deposit from the buyer, they will telephone the seller's solicitors to exchange contracts. Once contracts have been exchanged, the buyer will be contractually bound to complete on the completion date. If you're buying a property and looking for a solicitor, please contact me, Justine Sims, at Osbornes Solicitors on 020 7485 8811 and I'll be able to answer any of your questions.